So the Great Depression was the worst economic downturn of the 20th century and lasted a really long time. And so this graph sort of shows what went on during the Great Depression. The purple bar graphs are the unemployment rate over here on the right-hand axis. And you can see the unemployment rate hit a high of 25%. And basically, it was just a recession that got worse and worse. So the stock market crashed in 1929. And one of the problems with that was that a lot of the stock had been bought with borrowed money. And so when the stock market crashed, that money couldn't be repaid. And we ended up with a lot of bank failures. And so when the banks failed, we didn't have anything like deposit insurance that we do now. And so people lost their money. People took money out of the banks, leading to even further problems. And we ended up with industrial production that shrank by almost 40%. It looks like about 40% by 1932. Real GDP shrank by about 20%. Consumer prices started falling. They fell by about 20%. And the policies that were sort of initially tried by the Hoover administration just really didn't work, right? And so it wasn't until FDR was elected, and he didn't really have any great ideas himself, but he was willing to try anything. And things started getting better slowly. You can see by 1937, the unemployment rate was still 15%. Compare that to a high of 10% after the Great Recession. And you can see that it wasn't really getting better very fast. And unfortunately, they tightened monetary policy, they shrank fiscal policy in 1937, and that put us back into recession. Unemployment went back up to almost 20% until it really started falling with the preparations for World War II. So, what caused it? Well, there were sort of three positive feedback mechanisms that led to the problems. The first was the banking system failure, right? So we had all these banks that had loans that they had made that couldn't be repaid. They were initially, margin loans, loans to buy stock, but then as the economy got worse and worse, other loans couldn't be repaid, and these banks failed. And surviving banks freaked out, just as they did after the Great Recession. They raised interest rates on loans, which made credit harder to come by, and that made things worse. And then as the recession went on, people got more and more pessimistic about the future. They started saving more, reducing consumption, reducing industrial output. And then to top it off, we had deflation, right, where prices fell due to falling demand. And when prices are falling, you think, oh, right, well, I won't buy anything right now because it'll be cheaper in the future. And so, as we saw, the unemployment rate went up to 25%, and it was a significant economic crisis for the United States and for, other economies around the world. So here we can look at the change to GDP in going all the way back to 1924 through sort of the end of the Great Depression, the beginning of World War II. So we have household and business investment in the orange color, consumption of non-durable goods and services in the green, government purchases in black, and net exports in yellow. And you can see that there was a recession from 1926 to 1927. It was a fairly short recession. You can see that household and business investment fell by 3.5–4%. But then the economy recovered, consumption went up, investment went up, government purchases went up a little bit, net exports fell a little bit. And then we entered really the worst part of the Great Depression, which was from 1929 to 1933. And you can see that business and household investment fell by 15%. Consumption of non-durable goods and services fell by almost as much, about 12%. And government purchases didn't do much to try to offset that, right? So one of the things that we learned from the Great Depression was that fiscal policy, increasing spending and cutting taxes, can help boost aggregate demand, and that just wasn't being done. Net exports were a minor piece of the problem. Then, with the advent of the New Deal, right, with FDR, Household and business investment recovered somewhat. Consumption of non-durable goods and services recovered. Government spending started contributing to real GDP growth. And things were looking better in 1937, but then we had another recession. And again, investment fell off, consumption fell off. This time, however, the government had sort of learned its lesson and increased spending. And this time, fortunately, net exports also helped make the recession not as bad as it could have been. But then it really was in the late 30s when the US started preparing for World War II, which we were really doing well before Pearl Harbor. Government purchases increased, were over 10%, and that really helped the economy finally get out of the Great Depression. So if we think about government policy, one of the problems was that fiscal policy did nothing between 1929 and 1933. You can see the federal government budget balance as a percentage of GNP. GNP is just like GDP. It stands for gross national product. It just depends whether you draw the lines around the border of the country or the people in the country. You can see that it didn't really start decreasing until 1932. And then, FDR and the New Deal kept a deficit for a while. The short-term nominal interest rate wasn't really cut until, at least not cut significantly, until FDR came into power. The unemployment rate had shot up, and the real interest rate, remember, the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus inflation. Well, we weren't having positive inflation, we were having deflation. So minus a negative number is a positive number. And so the short-term real interest rate actually shot above 10% in the early 1930s. And so one of the things that FDR tried to do was to get inflation going. And the way that they did that was to get off of the gold standard, right? So the gold standard said that you could exchange your money for gold, but that meant that your monetary policy was very weak. So the UK actually left the gold standard first in 1931, and then the US basically left the gold standard in 1933. They had some sort of shenanigans about how much a dollar was actually worth in terms of gold. But they were basically off the gold standard in 1933, and countries, as soon as they left the gold standard, they found their short-term real interest rates falling, and that helped encourage growth. So the New Deal, remember, Roosevelt was elected in 1932. He's inaugurated in 1933, and he implements the New Deal, which is a lot of spending on public works, relief programs to increase aggregate demand, just making sure people had work and money so that they could spend. They also, as we said, left the gold standard, nominal interest rates were reduced, and they put in a number of banking reforms. So the first thing that Roosevelt did when he was inaugurated was to declare a bank holiday, which sounds great, but that actually means the banks are all closed and they're trying to figure out which banks are healthy and which banks need to shut down. And so some banks were shut down, others were consolidated. And then one of the first things they did was to implement depository insurance so that if your bank was going out of business, you would be protected. And they put in a whole lot of banking reforms known as the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banking from investment banking, eliminated interest paid on checking accounts to try to reduce competition between banks. And banking was sort of a very boring and not too profitable business from the mid 1930s until the mid 1970s and early 80s when we started getting rid of all these regulations. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the Great Recession. So if we think about what happened from a household's point of view, right, early 1929, things are looking pretty good. Unemployment rate is low, so our expected future earnings are high. Our financial wealth is high because the stock market's up. Home equity is high. And yeah, we have some debt, but no big problem. And then the stock market crashes, the economy crashes, unemployment rate shoots up, which means our expected future earnings from employment is lower. Our financial wealth is lower because of the stock market crash. Home equity is lower, but our debt is still the same. And if we want to get back up to that target wealth, then we need to increase our savings and reduce consumption spending. And of course, we know that that just makes things worse. And so, by late 1933, things had recovered somewhat, um, but they still had a long way to go in terms of getting the unemployment rate back to where it was and getting people working again.